What would you do if the person you trusted most suddenly appeared in an engagement announcement with someone else? In today's emotional chapter, a shocking photo sends Tulac's world crashing down as rumors of Quan's engagement spread across the media. While misunderstandings grow and unanswered calls deepen the distance between them, Quan refuses to give up and races through a stormy night to reach the one person he can't bear to lose. If you love dramatic twists, heartfelt emotions, and unforgettable romance, be sure to subscribe and stay with us for every chapter ahead. The morning after the storm arrived with an unusual sense of calm. Golden sunlight slowly filtered through the clouds, spreading across the countryside as if nothing had happened the night before. Tiny droplets of rain still clung to the leaves in the garden, sparkling under the early light. The air smelled fresh and clean, carrying the scent of wet soil and distant rice fields. Everything seemed peaceful. Yet inside the small house, neither Quan nor Tulac felt at peace. The atmosphere was different from the mornings they had shared before. Normally, breakfast was filled with casual conversation, teasing remarks, and quiet laughter. There was always something comforting about sitting together at the old wooden table while the world outside slowly woke up. Today, however, silence lingered between them. Tulac carefully ladled warm porridge into 2 bowls and placed them on the table. Steam curled gently upward, filling the room with a familiar scent. "Eat before it gets cold," he said softly. Quan nodded. "Thank you." He picked up his spoon, but his attention was elsewhere. His thoughts remained trapped in yesterday's conversation with his father. The engagement, the partnership, the pressure waiting for him back in the city. Most of all, he couldn't stop thinking about Tulac. Ever since the storm, he had sensed something had changed. The smile was still there. The kindness was still there. But behind them, something felt different, as if an invisible distance had quietly appeared between them overnight. Across the table, Tulac lowered his eyes and stirred his porridge. He was trying his best to appear normal, trying not to think about what he had overheard, trying not to imagine the future his mind kept creating. But it was impossible. Every time he looked at Quan, the same words echoed inside his head. Engagement, trin, family agreement. The thoughts refused to leave him alone. Outside, birds chirped happily from the trees. Inside, every second felt heavier than the last. After several minutes of silence, Quan finally spoke. "Tulac." Quan hesitated. There were so many things he wanted to say, so many things he wanted to explain, yet suddenly he wasn't sure where to begin. "About yesterday," Tulac immediately looked down at his bowl. "You don't need to explain," Quan frowned. "But I want to." The answer came almost instantly. "It's your personal matter." The words sounded calm, polite, reasonable, but somehow they hurt more than anger would have. Quan stared at him. "I don't want you to misunderstand." Tulac forced a smile. "Why would I misunderstand?" Before Quan could answer, his phone suddenly began ringing. The sharp sound cut through the room. Both men instinctively looked toward the screen. The moment Quan saw the caller ID, his expression darkened. "Father." Again. The phone continued vibrating on the table. Neither moved. Neither spoke. Finally, Quan picked it up. "Dad." The voice on the other end wasted no time. "Where are you?" "At Tulac's place." "When are you coming back?" Quan sighed quietly. "I told you already. Soon." "No." His father's tone immediately hardened. "Not soon. Today." Quan rubbed his forehead. "Dad, you've avoided this long enough." The interruption came sharply. "We need to discuss the future of the company." "Then let's discuss it tomorrow." "There won't be a tomorrow if you continue acting like this." The pressure in his father's voice grew heavier. "Return immediately." Quan remained silent. His father continued. "The Trin family is expecting an answer." "I never agreed to anything." "You don't need to agree yet." "Then what's the rush?" "The rush," his father replied coldly, "is that people are waiting. The room suddenly felt smaller, more suffocating. Quan glanced toward Tulac. He noticed that Tulac wasn't eating anymore. His spoon remained motionless. His eyes remained fixed on the table. A knot formed in Quan's chest. "Dad, I'll call you later." "No." The answer came instantly. "You're returning today." A brief silence followed. Then his father added one final sentence. "If you don't come back yourself, I'll come there." The call ended. The room fell silent once more. Only the distant sound of birds could be heard outside. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Tulac forced another smile. "You should go." Quan looked at him. "I don't want to." The answer surprised both of them. Tulac laughed softly. "That's not how responsibility works." Quan leaned back in his chair. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely frustrated. Not because of work, not because of business, but because every instinct was telling him to stay. Stay here. Stay with the peaceful mornings. Stay with the garden. Stay with the person sitting across from him. Yet reality was waiting elsewhere. Eventually, breakfast ended. Neither had eaten much. Neither mentioned it. The morning passed quickly. Too quickly. Before long, Quan found himself standing beside his car. The countryside road stretched quietly ahead. The sky was bright blue once again. The storm felt like a distant memory. Tulac stood nearby, hands tucked casually into his pockets, trying to appear relaxed, trying to make this goodbye seem ordinary. But deep down, neither believed it was. Quan looked toward the house, then toward the garden, then back at Tulac. A strange feeling settled over him. He suddenly realized how much he had grown attached to this place, attached to these simple routines, attached to this person. "Take care of yourself," Tulac said. "You too. And don't skip meals." Quan laughed softly. "That's usually my line." "Then I'm borrowing it." For the first time that morning, a genuine smile appeared between them, but it disappeared far too quickly. The moment felt fragile, temporary, as though both knew something important was changing. Quan took a step closer. "I'll call you." "Okay. And I'll come back soon." Tulac nodded. "Okay." The answer was simple, yet for some reason it didn't feel reassuring. Quan wanted to say more, wanted to explain, wanted to tell him that nothing had been decided, that the engagement wasn't real, that he wasn't interested in Trin, that the person occupying his thoughts wasn't Trin at all. But the words never came. Instead, he opened the car door. One last look, one last smile. Then he got inside. The engine started. Slowly, the vehicle began moving down the narrow country road. Tulac remained standing at the gate, watching. The car became smaller and smaller. The distance grew wider. Eventually, it disappeared entirely. Still, he didn't move. A gentle breeze rustled through the fields. Minutes passed, then several more. Only when the road was completely empty did he finally turn back toward the house. And suddenly, everything felt different. The garden seemed quieter. The house seemed larger. The newly built table beneath the Sephora tree looked strangely lonely. A painful emptiness settled over him, one he didn't want to acknowledge. Hours later, Quan returned to the city. The transition felt immediate. Traffic filled the roads. Buildings stretched endlessly toward the sky. Car horns echoed through crowded streets. The peaceful countryside felt impossibly far away. As he drove through the city center, his phone buzzed repeatedly with work notifications. Meetings, emails, schedules, requests. The life he had temporarily escaped was waiting exactly where he left it. Yet instead of relief, he felt exhausted. By the time he arrived home, his father was already waiting, standing in the living room, arms crossed, expression serious. "You're late." "I came as soon as I arrived." His father glanced at his watch. "Get changed." Quan frowned. "Why?" "We have dinner." "With who?" His father stared at him as though the answer should have been obvious. "The Trin family." A familiar frustration immediately returned. "Tonight?" "Yes." I just got back. And that's exactly why you're going. Quan closed his eyes briefly. He already knew arguing would accomplish nothing. A few minutes later, he found himself walking upstairs to prepare. As he changed clothes, his thoughts drifted elsewhere. Not toward the dinner, not toward business, not toward Trin. Instead, he found himself wondering what Tulac was doing right now. Whether he had eaten lunch, whether he was working in the garden, whether he was thinking about him at all. The realization made him pause. Then slowly, a small smile appeared. And for the first time all day, he reached for his phone, intending to send a message. But before he could type a single word, someone knocked on the door. Quan, his father called. We're leaving. The message remained unsent, and with that, he headed downstairs toward a dinner that would soon change everything. The drive to the restaurant felt much longer than it actually was. Quan sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window as the city lights flashed past. Traffic moved steadily through the evening streets while countless people hurried home after work. Normally, this was a world he understood, a world of schedules, negotiations, business dinners, and carefully planned conversations. But tonight, he felt disconnected from it. His thoughts kept drifting back to the countryside, to the small house surrounded by fields, to the newly built wooden table beneath a Sephora tree, to the quiet mornings and simple conversations that somehow brought him more peace than any luxury ever had. Most of all, his thoughts kept returning to Tulac, the way he smiled, the way he worried about others before himself, the way he always seemed to know exactly when Quan needed a moment of silence. A faint sigh escaped him. Across from him, his father noticed. You should focus on tonight. Quan looked away from the window. I am. His father didn't believe him. Neither did Quan. A short time later, the car arrived at one of the city's most exclusive private dining venues. Everything about the place reflected wealth and influence. Elegant architecture, polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, private dining rooms reserved for important guests. The kind of place where business deals worth millions could be discussed over dinner. As soon as Quan entered, he understood exactly what this evening was meant to accomplish. The Trin family had already arrived. Trin's father greeted them warmly. It's good to finally see you. Likewise, Quan's father replied. Pleasantries were exchanged. Smiles appeared. Hands were shaken. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like two respected families strengthening an already successful partnership. But Quan could already feel the invisible expectations hanging in the room. Then he saw Trin. She stood beside her parents wearing a simple but elegant dress. Confident, graceful, professional. The kind of person who fit naturally into the world of powerful families and corporate leadership. She smiled politely. Welcome back. Thank you. The greeting was brief, yet Trin immediately noticed something. Quan wasn't really present. His body was there. His attention wasn't. Throughout dinner, conversations flowed smoothly between the older generation. Investment opportunities, future cooperation, market expansion, long-term strategic plans. One topic naturally led to another. The atmosphere remained positive. Everyone seemed pleased. Everyone except Quan. Several times he glanced toward his phone. Several times he checked the screen. Several times disappointment crossed his face when there were no new messages. Trin quietly observed everything. Eventually, she leaned slightly closer. You seem distracted. Quan looked up. Sorry? You've checked your phone at least 10 times. A small smile appeared on her face. I counted. Quan let out a short laugh. Did you really? I was curious. About what? About who has your attention? The question caught him off guard. For a moment, he didn't answer. Trin noticed. Interesting, she thought. Very interesting. Most people in Quan's position would have responded immediately. Instead, he remained silent. That silence told her far more than words could. You don't have to answer, she said. Quan offered a polite smile. Thank you. The dinner continued, but Trin found herself paying less attention to the business discussions and more attention to the man sitting beside her, because one thing had become increasingly obvious. Whatever occupied Quan's thoughts tonight had nothing to do with business, and nothing to do with her. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Tulac was trying to keep himself busy. After Quan left, the house felt strangely empty. The silence lingered in every room. To distract himself, he spent most of the afternoon working in the garden. He harvested vegetables, cleaned tools, organized supplies, anything to avoid thinking too much. Yet every task somehow reminded him of Quan. The wooden table beneath the sephora tree, the hammer still resting near the shed, the cups they had used while drinking winter melon tea. Even the pathway through the garden seemed filled with memories. By evening, he found himself standing beneath the sephora tree. The newly finished table sat exactly where they had left it. One chair remained empty. His eyes lingered on it longer than he intended. Then he quickly looked away. Back in the city, dinner was finally coming to an end. Dessert had been served. Coffee cups were gradually emptied. The atmosphere remained warm and relaxed. Then someone suggested taking family photographs. A completely ordinary request. At least that's what it seemed. Immediately, staff members prepared a backdrop near the dining area. Everyone stood and gathered together. Quan instinctively stepped back. "You don't need me in the picture." His father frowned. "Don't be ridiculous. It's a family photo." "Exactly." His father's expression hardened. "You're part of this discussion." Before Quan could respond, Trin lightly touched his arm. "It's only a picture." Her tone was friendly, non-confrontational. Reluctantly, Quan stopped resisting. The families gathered together. Parents stood in the center. Business partners arranged themselves nearby. Quan ended up standing beside Trin. Camera flashes immediately filled the room. One photograph, then another, then several more. Everyone smiled politely. The entire process lasted less than 5 minutes. To those inside the room, it seemed insignificant. Unfortunately, not everyone observing the evening was inside. Outside the venue, several journalists had been waiting. The cooperation between the two powerful families had already attracted attention. The moment photographs surfaced, speculation began. And speculation spread quickly, very quickly. Before midnight, several business blogs published articles. By morning, larger media outlets had picked up the story. Headlines appeared everywhere. CEO Quan and Trin family heir expected to announce engagement. Major corporate alliance may lead to wedding. Sources suggest relationship between two influential families growing stronger. The story exploded across social media. Photos circulated rapidly. Comments multiplied. Assumptions became facts in the eyes of the public. Back in the countryside, the next morning arrived peacefully, at least on the surface. Tulac spent the early hours watering vegetables near the garden fence. The weather was beautiful. The sky was clear. Birds moved between the trees. Everything looked calm. Then a familiar neighbor hurried toward him carrying a phone. "Have you seen the news?" Tulac looked up. "What news?" The neighbor turned the screen around. "Isn't this your friend?" At first, Tulac didn't understand. Then he saw the photograph and froze. His entire body went still. The image showed Quan standing beside Trin, both dressed elegantly, both surrounded by smiling family members. At first glance, they looked exactly like a couple celebrating an important announcement. Beneath the photograph, the headline was impossible to ignore. "CEO Quan preparing for engagement?" The words hit him like a physical blow. For several seconds, he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. The neighbor continued talking, but the voice sounded distant, faded, almost unreal. Because in that moment, only one thing mattered. The photograph, the headline, the confirmation of everything he had feared. Suddenly, yesterday's conversation echoed through his mind. The phone call, the pressure from Quan's father, the discussion about Trin, the mention of an engagement. Every piece now seemed to fit together. His chest tightened painfully. Maybe this had always been the future waiting for Quan. Maybe he had simply refused to see it. Maybe he had allowed himself to believe in something that was never truly possible. A sharp ache spread through him, one he couldn't explain, one he didn't want to acknowledge. Meanwhile, in the city, Quan was experiencing a very different reaction. The moment he saw the articles, his expression darkened. "What is this?" His assistant looked nervous. The story started spreading overnight. Quan immediately opened the articles. Each one made the situation worse. Speculation, rumors, false assumptions. None of it was true. Yet thousands of people already believed it. Then a sudden realization struck him. Tulac. If he had seen these articles, a sense of urgency immediately filled him. Without hesitation, Quan grabbed his phone. The first call connected, ringing. Once, twice, 3 times. No answer. He frowned, then called again. Still nothing. A third attempt. Silence. Back in the countryside, Tulac stared at his own phone. The screen continued lighting up. Quan calling. The words felt almost painful to look at. His heart told him to answer, to listen, to give Quan a chance to explain. But fear held him back. What if the explanation only confirmed everything? What if hearing the truth hurt even more? The phone stopped ringing. For a moment, the screen went dark. Then another notification appeared. A message. "It's not what you think." Moments later, another. "Please answer." Then another. "Tulac, let me explain." Tulac stared at the messages. His vision slowly blurred. He lowered his gaze. The phone rang again. Quan calling. The screen illuminated his face. The ringtone echoed softly through the quiet garden. For several long seconds, he simply stared at it. The call continued, waiting, begging to be answered. But in the end, Tulac did nothing. His fingers tightened around the phone. The ringing finally stopped, and the screen went dark once more. The screen had gone dark, yet Tulac continued staring at the phone as if another call might appear at any second. The garden around him remained peaceful. The morning breeze moved gently through the vegetables. Birds sang from nearby trees. Everything looked exactly the same as it had the day before. But inside him, something felt completely different. Slowly, he lowered the phone into his lap. His eyes drifted back toward the article. The photograph remained there. Quan standing beside Trin, the smiling family members, the headlines that seemed to confirm everything he had feared since overhearing that phone call during the storm. A painful knot formed in his chest. He wanted to believe there was another explanation. He wanted to believe the articles were wrong, but every piece seemed to fit together too perfectly. The engagement discussion, the pressure from Quan's father, the urgent return to the city, the family dinner, the photographs, the rumors. All of it pointed toward the same conclusion, a future that didn't include him. "Tulac?" The neighbor's voice pulled him back to reality. "You okay?" He forced a small smile. "I'm fine." The answer came automatically. The same answer people gave when they didn't want anyone asking questions. The neighbor nodded and eventually walked away. Soon, Tulac was alone again, alone with his thoughts. And unfortunately, those thoughts refused to leave him in peace. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Quan was becoming increasingly frustrated. He stared at his phone. No answer, no response. No sign that Tulac had even read the messages. The silence worried him more than anger would have. If Tulac were angry, at least he would know where they stood. But silence? Silence meant uncertainty, and uncertainty was something Quan hated. He immediately typed another message. "I can explain everything." Send. A few seconds later, "There is no engagement. Send." Then another, "Please trust me." After sending it, he stared at the screen, waiting. Nothing happened. No reply. No indication that the messages had even been opened. Quan ran a hand through his hair. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. Business problems could be solved. Negotiations could be managed. Crisis situations could be controlled. But this was different, because it involved someone whose opinion mattered to him far more than he was willing to admit. A knock interrupted his thoughts. His assistant stepped into the office. "Your father is asking for you." Quan's expression immediately hardened. "Now?" "Yes." Quan looked at his silent phone one last time before standing. A few minutes later, he entered the executive conference room. His father was already waiting. Several senior advisors sat nearby. The atmosphere felt serious, tense, as though an important decision had already been made. "Sit down," his father said. Quan remained standing. "What is this about?" His father placed a folder on the table. "The Trin partnership." Immediately, irritation flashed across Quan's face. "Again, this isn't going away. I never asked for it." "That's irrelevant." The answer came instantly. "This partnership benefits everyone, except me." The room fell silent. Several advisors exchanged nervous glances. No one seemed comfortable witnessing the conversation. Quan's father leaned forward. "Stop behaving like a child." The statement only fueled Quan's frustration. "A child?" His voice remained calm, dangerously calm. "You're discussing my future without asking what I want." His father sighed. "This isn't only about what you want. Then maybe that's the problem." Silence followed, heavy silence, the kind that appears before an argument truly begins. Finally, his father spoke again. "The media attention has already started." "I noticed." "Good." His father folded his hands together. "Then you understand why we should move forward." Quan stared at him in disbelief. "The media creates a rumor, and your solution is to make it true?" "The solution is stability." "No." Quan shook his head. "The solution is honesty." His father stood. "So what exactly are you planning to do?" For the first time, neither looked away. The tension between them seemed to fill the room. Then Quan answered, "The truth." His father laughed once, a short, humorless laugh. "The truth doesn't always help business." "Maybe I don't care." The room became completely silent. Several advisors immediately lowered their eyes. No one wanted to be caught in the middle, because everyone understood one thing. This was no longer a business discussion. It was a battle between a father and his son, and neither side intended to surrender. Back in the countryside, Tulac spent the rest of the day trying to distract himself. He cleaned the house, prepared food, worked in the garden, organized storage shelves, anything to stay busy. Yet no matter what he did, his thoughts always returned to Quan. Every corner of the property reminded him of him. The cup Quan used every morning, the chair he always sat in, the wooden table they built together beneath a sephora tree. As afternoon arrived, Tulac eventually found himself sitting there alone. The empty chair across from him seemed impossible to ignore. He remembered the day they had finished building it, the tea they shared, the laughter, the peaceful conversation beneath the shade of the tree. At the time, he had believed there would be more days like that. Now he wasn't so sure. A soft breeze moved through the branches overhead. Several leaves drifted down onto the table. Tulac stared at them silently. Then his phone vibrated again. His heart immediately reacted. Hope appeared before he could stop it. He reached for the device. "Quan," another message. "I need to talk to you." Tulac swallowed hard. A second message followed. "Please answer." Then another. "I'll explain everything." For several moments, he simply stared at the screen. Part of him desperately wanted to answer, to hear Quan's voice, to believe there was some misunderstanding. But another part was afraid, because if the truth hurt, there would be no going back. Eventually, he locked the phone and placed it face down on the table. The silence returned. Yet somehow it felt even heavier than before. Across the city, Quan stared out the window of his office. Dark clouds were beginning to gather once again. A storm was approaching, much like the one building inside him. His phone remained in his hand. Still no response. Still nothing from Tulac. The feeling unsettled him, because for the first time since returning to the city, he realized something important. The possibility of losing Tulac frightened him. More than the media rumors, more than the partnership, more than the argument with his father. The realization arrived quietly, but once it appeared, it refused to leave. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Quan looked toward the darkening sky, then back toward the silent phone in his hand, and a decision slowly began forming in his mind. The decision stayed with Quan for the rest of the afternoon. No matter how many meetings he attended, no matter how many documents were placed in front of him, no matter how many people asked for his attention, his thoughts always returned to the same place. Tulac, the unanswered calls, the unread messages, the silence. Most people would have considered it a small thing, a missed phone call, a delayed reply. Nothing unusual, but Quan knew better. Something was wrong. And the longer the silence continued, the more uneasy he became. Outside his office window, dark clouds continued gathering above the city skyline. The bright afternoon gradually faded beneath a blanket of gray. Thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance. The approaching storm felt strangely familiar. It reminded him of the night before he had left the countryside, the night everything had started to change. A knock sounded at the door. His assistant entered carefully. "The board meeting begins in 10 minutes. Quan nodded. "I'll be there." But even as he said the words, he already knew he wasn't thinking about the board meeting, because at that exact moment, somewhere far away, Tulac was still refusing to answer him. And for reasons he could no longer deny, that mattered more. Meanwhile, in the countryside, evening settled slowly over the small house. The sky darkened. The wind strengthened. Leaves rustled through the garden. Tulac stood by the kitchen window watching the changing weather. Normally, storms brought him comfort. There was something peaceful about listening to rain strike the roof while the world outside slowed down. Tonight felt different. Tonight, every sound seemed to make the loneliness more noticeable. The house felt too quiet, too empty. His eyes drifted toward the chair Quan always used during breakfast, then toward the wooden table beneath the sephora tree outside. The memories returned immediately. Quan laughing while trying to carry oversized winter melons. Quan insisting he could build the table without instructions. Quan drinking tea beneath the tree. Quan smiling. The images appeared effortlessly, as if his mind refused to let go. Tulac closed his eyes, but that only made the memories clearer. A sudden vibration pulled him back. His phone. For a brief second, his heart raced. He already knew who it would be. Slowly, he looked at the screen. Another message. From Quan. "I don't care about the articles." A second message arrived. "I don't care what people are saying." Then a third. "I care about talking to you." Tulac stared at the words. His fingers tightened around the phone. The familiar ache returned, because part of him wanted desperately to believe those messages. Part of him wanted to answer, wanted to hear Quan's voice, wanted to hear him say everything was a misunderstanding, but fear remained stronger. What if he was wrong? What if this was only temporary? What if Quan eventually chose the life waiting for him in the city? The questions never stopped, and because he couldn't find the answers, he did the only thing he thought he could do. He placed the phone aside and remained silent. Back in the city, the board meeting ended. Executives left one by one. The conference room gradually emptied. Soon, only Quan remained. The rain had started. Tiny droplets struck the windows overlooking the city. The weather forecast had been correct. Another storm was arriving. Quan looked at his phone once more. No response. Nothing. Hours had passed. Still nothing. A strange frustration mixed with worry inside him. Finally, he stood. Enough. He grabbed his jacket, his car keys, his phone, then headed toward the elevator. Several employees noticed him leaving. "Sir, do you have another meeting?" "No." "Should we prepare tomorrow's schedule?" "Tomorrow can wait." The answer surprised everyone, because Quan was not the type of person who allowed work to wait. Yet tonight was different. The elevator doors closed. Moments later, he stepped into the underground parking garage. Rain echoed through the structure above. The storm had grown stronger. His phone rang suddenly. He glanced at the screen. His father. For several seconds, he considered ignoring it. Eventually, he answered, "Dad, where are you? Leaving? To where?" Quan opened the driver's door. "I have something important to do." His father's tone immediately sharpened. "This is about that countryside boy, isn't it?" Silence. That silence was answer enough. His father sighed heavily. "Quan, Dad, think carefully about what you're doing." "I already have. You're risking everything." Quan looked through the windshield at the rain pouring outside. For a moment, memories flashed through his mind. The peaceful mornings, the shared meals, the laughter beneath the Sephora tree, the simple happiness he had found there. Then he answered quietly, "No." His father frowned. "What do you mean, no?" "I'm risking everything by ignoring what matters." The line went silent. Neither spoke. Finally, Quan ended the call. He placed the phone down, started the engine, and drove out into the storm. Rain hammered against the windshield. The wipers moved back and forth at full speed. Headlights blurred across wet roads. Traffic slowed. Visibility dropped. But none of it mattered, because every kilometer brought him closer to only one destination, the countryside, Tulac. Hours passed. The city lights eventually disappeared behind him. Skyscrapers gave way to open roads. Open roads became fields. Fields became familiar countryside landscapes. The storm followed him the entire way. Inside the small house, Tulac had given up trying to sleep. The rain outside had become heavy. Thunder echoed through the night. He sat beside the window staring into the darkness. The phone remained nearby. Silent. For some reason, that bothered him even more. The messages had stopped. The calls had stopped. The persistence had stopped. A strange emptiness settled over him. Maybe Quan had finally given up. The thought hurt more than he expected. Almost immediately, he hated himself for thinking it. Because what right did he have to feel disappointed? Quan had a life, a future, responsibilities. Perhaps this distance was inevitable. Perhaps he simply needed to accept it. A bright flash of lightning illuminated the yard. For a brief second, the entire property became visible. Then darkness returned. Several minutes later, another flash appeared. This time, something else caught his attention. Headlights, far away, approaching. Tulac frowned. Who would be driving here this late during a storm? The lights grew closer, slowly, steadily. His heartbeat began to accelerate. The vehicle turned onto the familiar road leading toward the house. Closer, closer. Then finally stopped outside the gate. The engine shut off. Rain continued pouring from the sky. For a moment, nothing happened. Neither did Tulac. He remained frozen beside the window, unable to look away. Then the driver's door opened. A figure stepped out into the storm. Even through the rain, he recognized him immediately. Quan. Tulac's breath caught. His heart pounded against his chest. What was he doing here? The rain soaked Quan within seconds, but he didn't seem to care. He closed the car door, looked toward the house, then began walking toward the gate. Inside, Tulac instinctively took a step backward. His emotions collided all at once. Relief, shock, confusion, fear, hope, all tangled together. Outside, Quan finally reached the front entrance. Rainwater dripped from his hair and clothing. His breathing was uneven from the long drive. Yet his eyes remained fixed on the house, fixed on the place where Tulac was waiting. For several seconds, neither moved. The storm raged around them. Thunder rolled overhead. Rain struck the roof relentlessly. Then Quan slowly raised his hand and knocked on the door. The sound echoed through the silent house. Once, twice, 3 times. "Tulac," his voice carried through the storm, soft, exhausted, determined. "I know you're inside." Inside the house, Tulac stood frozen, his hand trembling slightly at his side. The distance between them had become only a single door, yet somehow it felt like the most difficult distance either of them had ever faced. And as the rain continued pouring outside, neither knew what would happen next. After returning to the city under pressure from his father, Quan is forced to attend a dinner with Trin's family, where a simple group photo quickly sparks rumors of an upcoming engagement. When the media spreads the story, Tulac is devastated after seeing headlines that seem to confirm his worst fears. Believing Quan may be choosing his family's expectations over his own feelings, he withdraws and refuses to answer any calls or messages. Desperate to clear up the misunderstanding, Quan repeatedly reaches out, insisting that the rumors are false. As silence grows between them, the distance becomes more painful than either expected. Realizing he cannot lose Tulac without a fight, Quan makes a bold decision. Through a violent storm and endless rain, he drives back to the countryside, arriving at Tulac's door with only one goal: to tell him the truth.